She stood at the center of the room where condemnation gathered like smoke, her hands clasped so tightly the bones showed white beneath the skin. The air pressed down with the weight of verdict, and the faces around her blurred into masks of pity and disdain. He entered without announcement, and the very walls seemed to lean toward him, as if the stone itself recognized its master. Their eyes met across the distance of social chasms, hers clouded with the residue of loss, his sharp as a blade drawn in darkness. What passed between them was not greeting but recognition, the kind that splits the soul open and leaves it breathing in a new rhythm. The pendant at her throat caught the candlelight and fractured it, scattering fragments of brightness across the floor like fallen stars. Before we dive into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The manor of Ashford Heath rose from the moorland like a confession carved in stone, its towers reaching toward a sky that seldom offered mercy. Rain fell in sheets that transformed the landscape into something between earth and ocean, and the wind carried with it the scent of heather crushed underfoot by centuries of sorrow. Inside the great hall, where tapestries depicted victories no one remembered and defeats everyone whispered about, the fire struggled against drafts that came through cracks in masonry older than memory. The servants moved through shadows with the practiced silence of those who understood that invisibility was survival, their footsteps muffled by rushes scattered across flagstones worn smooth by generations of grief. Lydia stood near the servants' entrance, her fingers working the frayed edge of her apron with a rhythm born of anxiety. She was neither servant nor family, but something more precarious, the widow of the youngest son, the one who had died before providing an heir, before securing her place in the architecture of succession. They called her barren, though no physician had examined her, no midwife had declared it. The word simply attached itself to her like moss to north-facing stone, spreading quietly until it covered everything she might have been. Her dress was dark wool, modest to the point of erasure, and around her neck hung a locket of tarnished silver, its clasp broken, held closed by a twist of black thread. Inside was a lock of hair so pale it might have been moonlight, the only remnant of a marriage that had lasted less than a season. The hall filled gradually with the members of the household and their allies from neighboring estates. Lady Constance, the matriarch who ruled Ashford Heath with the precision of a general and the warmth of winter iron, entered with her daughters flanking her like sentries. They were beautiful in the way of carefully tended gardens, their beauty a product of intention rather than accident. Their gowns whispered secrets to the floor, fabric imported from places where sunlight came without negotiation. They looked at Lydia the way one might look at furniture left too long in the rain, something that had once served a purpose but now merely occupied space. The younger servants watched with eyes that understood the particular cruelty of being unwanted. A girl named Moll, who scrubbed pots in the scullery and slept on straw by the kitchen hearth, caught Lydia's gaze for a moment and offered the smallest inclination of her head. It was not solidarity exactly, but acknowledgment, one ghost recognizing another in the gathering dusk. The housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, tall and angular as the shadows she commanded, moved through the room adjusting candles with fingers that seemed to lengthen in the flickering light. She had been the one to deliver the news that morning, her voice crisp as frost. The family had made arrangements for Lydia's future, for her removal to a place where unsuccessful wives were sent to learn useful trades or fade into the obscurity that failure deserved. The document lay on the table near the hearth, 2 pages of parchment bound with ribbon the color of old blood. Lady Constance had signed it with flourishes that turned her name into something decorative and final. The wax seal bore the family crest, a falcon with wings spread, talons extended toward prey that would never escape. Lydia had not been permitted to read it, but she understood its content the way one understands the approach of storm by the quality of silence that precedes it. She would be sent away within the fortnight, delivered to the Sisters of Charitable Reformation, an institution that promised to teach humility to those who had forgotten their place. That she had never known her place to begin with seemed irrelevant to those who made such decisions. The fire crackled and sent sparks climbing toward the chimney like prayers that would not be answered. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the leaded windows with a sound like coins scattered on a grave. Lydia's breathing came shallow, her ribs aching with the effort of appearing composed. She had learned to make herself small, to occupy the corners of rooms, to exist in the margins of conversations. But tonight the margins had collapsed, and she found herself exposed in the center of a room that wanted nothing more than to forget her entirely. When he arrived, there was no announcement, no herald to proclaim his presence. The door simply opened, and the temperature of the room changed as if winter itself had taken human form and stepped across the threshold. Lord Grayson Aldrich, the Duke of Thornmere, moved with the deliberate grace of a predator who had never known hunger but understood it intimately in others. His coat was black wool over a shirt of linen, so white it seemed to gather what little light the candles offered. His face was stern, carved with lines that spoke of decisions made in darkness, of burdens carried without complaint. His eyes were gray as the moors in November, and when they swept across the room, people straightened as if pulled by invisible strings. He was not a frequent visitor to Ashford Heath, though the families were connected by old alliances and newer debts. His presence here tonight had been unexpected, mentioned in whispered conversations that Lydia had overheard while serving wine to the family before dinner. Lady Constance had seemed pleased in the tight-lipped way of those for whom pleasure is a strategic calculation. Her daughters had exchanged glances sharp as needles, already measuring themselves against whatever matrimonial prospects his appearance might suggest. The eldest, Arabella, had changed her gown twice before settling on emerald silk that matched her eyes and announced her intentions. Lord Grayson took his place at the head of the table without ceremony, and the others arranged themselves in the hierarchy his presence demanded. Lady Constance sat to his right, her spine rigid with the effort of appearing both gracious and authoritative. Her daughters settled like birds on a branch, each angling for the best light, the most favorable perspective. The men of the household, cousins and hangers-on whose fortunes depended on proximity to power, positioned themselves with the careful choreography of those who understood that visibility could be either opportunity or liability. Lydia remained standing near the wall, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance where she could see without being seen to look. The conversation began with pleasantries that meant nothing, observations about the weather that were really negotiations about influence, compliments that concealed assessments of worth. Lord Grayson spoke little, his responses measured, his attention seemingly focused on the wine in his glass. But Lydia felt the weight of his awareness like pressure against her skin, as if the air between them had become denser, more deliberate. When his gaze finally found her, it was not the casual glance of someone noting a servant's presence, but something more considered, a look that saw through the drab wool and the broken locket to something underneath that even she did not fully recognize. Lady Constance, attuned to shifts in attention the way sailors read changes in wind, cleared her throat with delicate force. "We are most grateful for your presence this evening, Your Grace. It has been too long since Ashford Heath had the pleasure of your company." Her smile was practiced, perfect, and entirely without warmth. Lord Grayson inclined his head slightly, the gesture acknowledging her words without committing to their sentiment. "The roads are difficult this time of year," he replied, his voice low and textured like velvet drawn over stone. "But certain matters require attendance regardless of convenience." The fire hissed as moisture from a log turned to steam, and in that small sound Lydia heard the future collapsing into the present. Lady Constance's fingers, heavy with rings that had belonged to women now reduced to portraits on walls, tapped once against the table. "Indeed, we have matters of our own to attend to. Matters of reorganization." She paused, allowing the word to settle. "My late son's widow," and here she gestured toward Lydia with a movement so economical it barely disturbed the air, "will be departing soon for a more suitable situation. The Sisters of Charitable Reformation have graciously agreed to receive her." The statement hung in the room like smoke from snuff candles. Arabella smiled into her wine-glass. Her sister, Cecilia, examined her nails with sudden fascination. The men shifted in their seats, uncomfortable witnesses to a woman's disposal, relieved it was not their concern. Mrs. Graves, standing sentinel by the doorway, betrayed nothing, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped her ring of keys. Only Moll, barely visible in the shadows near the scullery entrance, allowed her face to show something approaching sorrow. Lord Grayson set his glass down with precision, the base meeting the wood without sound. "Charitable Reformation," he repeated, testing the phrase as one might test the edge of a blade. "An interesting characterization. Lady Constance's smile tightened at the corners. "We believe it is the most Christian course of action. She has no children, no prospects, no purpose here. The institution will provide her with training in useful domestic skills. She may find employment in a respectable household or, if she demonstrates sufficient piety, perhaps a position within the church itself." "How fortunate," Lord Grayson said, and the words carried a weight that made them anything but agreement. "To have her future so comprehensively decided." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly, and for the first time that evening he looked directly at Lydia with an expression that demanded she look back. She met his eyes for a heartbeat, then two, and in that exchange something passed between them that had no language but understanding. He saw what she was, not the failure they had named her, but the woman they had tried to erase. And she saw what he was, power that could destroy or defend, depending on the direction of its attention. "Your concern is noted, Your Grace," Lady Constance began, but he raised one hand, a gesture so slight it barely constituted movement, yet it silenced her completely. The room held its breath. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if listening. "I wonder," Lord Grayson said, his tone conversational but underlaid with something harder, "whether such haste is necessary. The young woman is recently widowed. Surely she deserves time to grieve before being dispatched to strangers." Lady Constance's jaw tightened, the muscles along her throat working as she swallowed her first response and reached for something more diplomatic. "Grief is a luxury we cannot always afford, Your Grace. The household has many mouths to feed, many responsibilities. We must be practical." Lord Grayson nodded slowly, as if considering this argument with great seriousness. "Practical," he echoed. "Yes, I am a great believer in practicality." He paused, and the pause stretched until it became its own kind of speech. "Which is why I find myself compelled to make a practical suggestion." The candles flickered as if disturbed by a draught no one else could feel. Arabella stopped mid-breath, her chest tight beneath her emerald bodice. Cecilia's hand froze halfway to her mouth, a piece of bread forgotten. The men leaned forward imperceptibly, drawn by the scent of something shifting, some balance about to tip. Mrs. Graves' keys clinked once against her belt, a sound like a small bell tolling. And Lydia, who had spent so long learning to disappear, found herself at the center of a moment that refused to let her vanish. "The young widow," Lord Grayson continued, his eyes still fixed on Lydia, "might serve better purpose under different protection. I find myself in need of someone to manage certain domestic affairs at Thornmere. The previous housekeeper has retired to live with her daughter, and the position remains unfilled." He shifted his gaze back to Lady Constance, and in his expression was the courteous ruthlessness of a man who knew his power and used it with surgical precision. "I would consider it a personal favor if you would permit me to offer Mrs. Hartley this opportunity." The silence that followed was absolute, a void into which all sound had been drawn and held prisoner. Lady Constance's face underwent a series of minute transformations. Shock, calculation, fury, and finally the smooth mask of resignation. She could refuse, certainly. This was her household, her decision, her unwanted daughter-in-law to dispose of as she saw fit. But to refuse the Duke of Thornmere, whose lands bordered her own, whose influence extended to London and beyond, whose displeasure could manifest in withdrawn invitations and suddenly recalled debts, that would be impractical indeed. "Your Grace is most generous," she managed, the words emerging through teeth that wanted to clench. "Though I would not wish to burden you with a woman of such limited capabilities." It was a last attempt, a final thrust to wound if she could not win. Lord Grayson's expression did not change, but something in his stillness became dangerous. "I am an excellent judge of capability, Lady Constance. I trust my own assessment in such matters." The document on the table, with its blood-red ribbon and falcon seal, seemed suddenly irrelevant, a contract rendered void before it could be executed. Lady Constance reached for it anyway, her fingers closing around the parchment with enough force to crease it. "Of course, if your Grace believes this arrangement serves both households, then we are pleased to accommodate." The words tasted of ash, but she spoke them with the clarity of someone who knew when a battle was lost and survival depended on graceful retreat. Lord Grayson rose, and the room rose with him, a collective movement of respect and relief. He did not look at Lydia again, Not directly, but his voice when he spoke next was meant for her as much as for the assembly. Mrs. Hartley will travel to Thornmere within the week. I will send a carriage and appropriate escort. Until then, she remains under my protection, and I trust she will be treated with the consideration that position demands. The phrase, under my protection, settled over Lydia like a cloak, heavy and warm and utterly transformative. It changed the air around her, the way others would now have to navigate her presence, the calculations they would make before speaking her name. She was no longer the disposable widow, the barren failure to be hidden away in an institution of last resort. She was under the protection of the Duke of Thornmere, and that made her untouchable in ways she was only beginning to understand. Lady Constance managed to maintain her composure through the remainder of the evening, though her daughters could barely contain their confusion and resentment. Arabella's smile had frozen into something brittle, her plans for capturing the Duke's attention now complicated by his inexplicable interest in someone she had never considered competition. Cecilia whispered furiously to her sister behind her fan, their words lost in the rustle of silk and the settling of logs in the fireplace. The men exchanged glances that spoke of political maneuvering beyond their comprehension, wondering what advantage the Duke saw in this strange act of charity, what larger game he was playing. Mrs. Graves approached Lydia after Lord Grayson had departed, his exit as quiet and absolute as his arrival. The housekeeper's face was unreadable, her eyes reflecting candlelight like water over stones. "You will need proper clothing for your journey," she said, her voice betraying nothing of her thoughts. "I will have the seamstress attend you tomorrow." It was not kindness exactly, but it was no longer cruelty either. Lydia nodded, her throat too tight for words, her mind struggling to encompass the vastness of what had just occurred. That night, alone in the small room she had occupied since her husband's death, Lydia stood at the window and looked out over the moors. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and trembling. The moon emerged from behind clouds like a face rising from dark water, its light turning the landscape silver and strange. She touched the broken locket at her throat, feeling the thread that held it closed, the fragility of all things that mattered. Tomorrow she would begin preparations for a life she could not yet imagine. But tonight, in this moment suspended between what had been and what would be, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of deliverance, the terrifying gift of a second chance. The household stirred before dawn, as it always did, with fires to be lit and bread to be baked and floors to be scrubbed clean of yesterday's tracked mud and spilled wine. Lydia rose with the servants, as she always had, unable to break the habits that had shaped the past year of her life. But when she entered the kitchen, Moll looked at her differently, with something approaching awe. "Is it true, then," the girl whispered, her hands still buried in dough, "that you're going to Thornmere? To serve the Duke himself?" Lydia hesitated, uncertain how to answer. Was she going to serve him? Or had he, in some incomprehensible way, chosen to serve her? "I am going to Thornmere," she said finally, and that at least was truth enough to speak aloud. Moll nodded, her eyes bright with vicarious hope, the kind that blooms in those who see someone escape a fate they themselves cannot avoid. "They say he's hard but fair," she offered. "Not cruel, just distant, like winter." Lydia smiled faintly at the comparison. "I am well acquainted with winter," she replied. The days that followed were strange, suspended between states of being. Lydia was no longer the unwanted widow awaiting disposal, but neither was she yet the woman who would walk through the doors of Thornmere as someone with a place, a purpose, a name that meant something beyond failure. The seamstress came and measured her in silence, her pins clacking against her teeth as she worked. She created 2 simple dresses of good dark wool, practical garments that acknowledged Lydia's new position without pretending to elegance she did not possess. There was also a cloak, lined with flannel, warm enough for the journey north, where Thornmere waited in its valley of mist and legend. Lady Constance avoided her, which was itself a form of acknowledgment. Arabella and Cecilia whispered when she passed, their words like needles that no longer quite pierced skin. The men of the household nodded to her now, a gesture that contained neither warmth nor hostility, merely the recognition that she existed in a different category than before. Mrs. Graves treated her with professional correctness, explaining the household accounts and the management systems that Lydia might find useful in her new role. It was an education delivered without affection, but without malice either. Practical information passed from one woman to another across the divide of circumstance. On the morning of her departure, the Duke's carriage arrived as promised. It was a substantial vehicle, black lacquered wood and brass fittings, drawn by 4 horses whose coats shone like polished stone. The driver was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, and beside him sat a footman who helped Lydia with her single trunk, all her worldly possessions compressed into a space no larger than a coffin. The household gathered to watch her leave, not out of affection, but out of that irresistible human need to witness transitions, to mark the moments when one life ends and another begins. Lady Constance stood in the doorway, her face composed into an expression of gracious dismissal. "We wish you well, Lydia," she said, using her given name for the first time in memory. It was not kindness that prompted it, but the need to demonstrate magnanimity in front of the Duke's servants, to show that she had always treated her daughter-in-law with appropriate consideration. Lydia curtsied, the gesture automatic, and climbed into the carriage without looking back at the house that had been both shelter and prison, refuge and sentence. The journey to Thornmere took the better part of 2 days, with a night spent at a respectable inn where the innkeeper treated Lydia with cautious deference after seeing the Duke's crest on the carriage door. The landscape changed as they traveled north, the gentle slopes of Ashford Heath giving way to wilder country, all stone and heather, and wind that never ceased its restless conversation. The sky seemed larger here, more present, as if the earth had stepped back to give the heavens room to breathe. Lydia watched it all through the window, her hands folded in her lap, the broken locket warm against her skin. Thornmere revealed itself gradually, first as a distant shape against the horizon, then as walls and towers emerging from the landscape as if grown from it rather than built upon it. The house was older than Ashford Heath, its stones darker, its windows fewer and more deeply set. It commanded the valley the way a hawk commands the air, with the absolute authority of something that belonged completely to where it was. The carriage rattled over a stone bridge, spanning a river that ran fast and dark with peat, and then they were climbing the approach road, passing through gates that opened as if they had been waiting. The household staff assembled in the courtyard to receive her, a line of faces that ranged from curious to skeptical, from welcoming to coolly assessing. The butler, Mr. Carlyle, was a man of perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had served the Duke's family for generations. He greeted Lydia with formal courtesy and introduced her to the others. The cook, the maids, the footmen, the stable hands, each occupying their place in the careful hierarchy that made such establishments function. They were respectful but reserved, waiting to see what sort of woman the Duke had brought into their midst, whether she would be ally or burden, help or hindrance. Lord Grayson was not present for her arrival. Mr. Carlyle explained that his Grace was attending to business in the northern reaches of the estate and would return by evening. Lydia was shown to her rooms, not the cramped servants' quarters she had expected, but a proper suite on the second floor with windows overlooking the valley and a sitting room where a fire had already been laid. It was more space than she had occupied in her entire life, more comfort than she had imagined possible. She stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly, trying to understand what it meant that she had been given this, trying to believe it was real and not some elaborate dream from which she would wake to find herself still at Ashford Heath, still awaiting exile to the Sisters of Charitable Reformation. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley like a blessing, she was summoned to dinner. Mr. Carlyle led her through corridors hung with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and tapestries that told stories in thread and dye. They reached a dining room smaller than the great hall at Ashford Heath, but no less impressive, with a table of dark wood and chairs upholstered in deep burgundy. Lord Grayson stood at the window, his back to the room, watching the last light drain from the western sky. He turned when she entered, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, these two people whose lives had become unexpectedly tangled by a decision made in the space between heartbeats. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, and his voice was gentler than she remembered, though still carrying that undertone of authority that seemed as natural to him as breathing. "I trust your journey was tolerable. It was, Your Grace." "Thank you." Her own voice sounded strange to her ears, too small for the room, too uncertain for the moment. He gestured to a chair, and she sat, aware of the weight of silver and crystal on the table, the way the candlelight caught in the facets of the wine glasses and scattered in tiny stars across the ceiling. He took his own seat, not at the head of the table, but across from her, close enough that she could see the gray in his eyes shift from ash to smoke to something softer. "I owe you an explanation," he began, and she started to protest, to say that he owed her nothing, that he had already given her everything. But he raised his hand, that same small gesture that had silenced Lady Constance, and she fell quiet. "I did not rescue you out of charity, though I hope the action was charitable. I did it because I recognized in you something I have spent my life trying to protect, the dignity of being seen for what you are, not what others declare you to be." He paused, reaching for his wine but not drinking, the glass merely a prop for hands that needed occupation. "My mother was considered barren for the first 10 years of her marriage. They whispered about her, pitted her, suggested my father set her aside. He refused. And then, when everyone had given up hope, I was born. She used to tell me that the world's timelines are not divine timelines, and that patience is the only real test of faith." His expression softened with memory, then firmed again with purpose. "When I saw you standing there, about to be discarded like broken furniture, I saw her. I saw every woman who has been measured by her womb and found wanting, as if the whole of human worth could be reduced to fertility." Lydia felt tears gathering but refused to let them fall, refused to turn this moment into something sentimental when it was clearly something more profound. "I don't know how to thank you," she managed. "I don't even know how to understand it." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, his gray eyes holding hers with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had heard about his sternness. "You don't have to thank me. You have to live, fully, without apology. That will be thanks enough." They dined in a silence that was not awkward but companionable, the kind that exists between people who understand that words are sometimes less truthful than the spaces between them. The food was simple but excellent, and Lydia ate without the knot of anxiety that had accompanied every meal at Ashford Heath, where each bite had felt like borrowed sustenance, undeserved nourishment. Here, she was permitted to be hungry. Here, she was permitted to exist. After dinner, Lord Grayson showed her the library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books, their spines creating a mosaic of knowledge and color that took her breath away. "You are welcome here," he said, gesturing to the shelves. "There is no subject forbidden, no volume off limits. I believe education is the only real form of freedom." He pulled down a volume bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. "This was my mother's favorite. Poetry. She said it taught her to name things the world wanted to keep nameless." Lydia took the book with reverent hands, opening it to a random page where words danced in faded ink, speaking of sorrow and resilience, of hearts that broke and mended and broke again but kept beating. She looked up at him, this man who had altered her fate with a few sentences spoken in a room full of people who believed themselves her betters. "Why poetry?" she asked. "Why not philosophy or scripture?" He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his stern features into something unexpectedly warm. "Because philosophy pretends to answer questions, and scripture pretends to certainty. But poetry asks questions, and accepts that some things remain mysterious. It seems the most honest of all the disciplines." He took the book back gently and returned it to its place among the others. "Read what calls to you. This is your freedom now, to choose what fills your mind, what shapes your thoughts." The weeks that followed established a rhythm that was entirely new to Lydia's experience. She rose when she wished, not when bells or obligations demanded. She took her meals in the small dining room or, on pleasant days, in the garden where roses bloomed late into autumn and the bees still hummed their drowsy songs. She managed the household accounts, as Lord Grayson had suggested, but discovered that Mrs. Dawson, the head housekeeper who had been away visiting family during Lydia's arrival, was more than competent and needed little oversight. The role he had offered her was real but not demanding, a position that gave her purpose without burdening her with expectations she could not meet. She spent long hours in the library, working her way through volumes of poetry and history, philosophy and botany. She learned about the world beyond the narrow confines of her previous life, discovered that there were women who wrote books and led expeditions, who painted masterpieces and studied stars. She found herself reflected in those pages, not as the failure she had been taught to believe herself, but as one possibility among infinite others, a life that was still being written, still open to revision. Lord Grayson was often absent, his duties taking him across the estate and beyond, but when he was present, they fell into a habit of meeting in the library after dinner. They would read in companionable silence, or sometimes discuss what they had read, their conversations ranging from the practical to the philosophical, from the weather to the nature of justice. He treated her as an intellectual equal, sought her opinions, challenged her thoughts, and listened when she spoke with an attention that made her feel as if her words mattered, as if she herself mattered in ways that had nothing to do with bloodlines or fertility or social utility. She noticed that the servants watched this developing friendship with interest, but not scandal. There was nothing improper in their interactions, nothing that suggested romance or impropriety. What existed between them was stranger and perhaps more valuable, a meeting of minds, a recognition of shared understanding, a friendship that crossed the boundaries of class and circumstance because both parties chose to allow it. It was revolutionary in its quietness, radical in its simplicity. One evening, as autumn deepened into the edge of winter, Lord Grayson found her in the library reading by firelight, her feet tucked beneath her in the large armchair that had become her favorite spot. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, and she looked up to find his expression softened by something she could not quite name. "You look at home here," he said, and it was observation rather than question. "I am," she replied, and realized as she spoke that it was true. For the first time in her life, she felt at home, not because of walls or furniture or even comfort, but because she was permitted to be herself without apology or explanation. He crossed to the window where rain had begun to fall, the drops catching the lamplight as they slid down the glass. "I received a letter from Lady Constance," he said, his tone neutral. "She inquires after your well-being, and suggests that perhaps you might be ready to return to Ashford Heath, that your time away has likely provided sufficient recuperation from your grief." Lydia's stomach tightened, the old fear rising like nausea. "She wants me to come back?" "She wants to reclaim her investment," Lord Grayson said bluntly. "Or more accurately, she wants to remove what she perceives as a source of embarrassment. My continued protection of you is a reminder of her failure to dispose of you quietly." He turned from the window to face her directly. "But what she wants is irrelevant. The question is what you want." Lydia set her book aside, her hands trembling slightly. "I want to stay," she said, the words emerging with more force than she intended. "I want to stay here, in this house, in this life. I don't want to go back to being invisible, to being nothing." "Then you will stay," he said simply. "I will write to Lady Constance and inform her that your position here is permanent, that you have proven invaluable to the household and will remain as long as you wish." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability breaking through the careful control. "And not only because you are useful, Lydia, but because you belong here, because Thornmere is better with you in it, because I am better with you in it." The admission hung between them, not a declaration of love, but something equally powerful, a confession of need, of recognition, of the simple truth that some connections transcend the boundaries society tries to impose. Lydia rose from her chair, moved to stand before him, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," she whispered. "To deserve you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished, and touched the locket at her throat, the broken clasp, the frayed black thread. "You survived," he said. "That's what you did. You survived being measured against an impossible standard and found wanting by people who had no right to judge. You survived grief and cruelty and dismissal. And you did it with grace, with dignity, with a strength that most of us will never possess." His fingers brushed her cheek, the gentlest of touches. "That's everything, Lydia. That's more than enough." She closed her eyes, let herself lean into his hand for just a moment, let herself accept the comfort he offered without questioning whether she deserved it. When she opened them again, his face was inches from hers, and in his eyes she saw reflected back the woman she was becoming. Not the barren widow, not the disposable failure, but someone with value, with purpose, with a future that was hers to shape. "Stay with me," he said, and it was both plea and promise. "Not as a servant, not as an obligation. Stay as yourself, as my companion, as the woman who reads poetry by firelight and asks questions philosophy cannot answer. Stay because this is where you belong, and I am selfish enough to want to keep you here. I will stay, she promised, and felt the words settle into her bones like truth finally recognized, like a name finally claimed. The fire crackled and sent shadows dancing across the book-lined walls. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, washing the world clean, marking the beginning of something that had no name yet but felt like redemption, felt like home, felt like the future finally becoming possible. The letter Lord Grayson sent to Ashford Heath was brief and absolute. Lady Constance received it in her morning room, her breakfast cooling on the table before her as she read his elegant script. Lydia would not be returning. Her position at Thornmere was permanent. Any future correspondence regarding her should be directed to His Grace personally. It was courteous in language, but unmistakable in meaning. Lydia was no longer within Lady Constance's power to command or dispose of. She had passed beyond the reach of those who had tried to erase her. Lady Constance set the letter down with hands that shook slightly, whether from rage or frustration, or the bitter recognition of defeat. Even she could not say. Arabella, entering the room at that moment, saw her mother's expression and asked what news had arrived. Nothing, Lady Constance replied, her voice tight. Nothing that concerns us any more. But it did concern them, would continue to concern them every time they passed Thornmere lands or heard the Duke's name mentioned in society, every reminder that they had tried to break someone and failed, that power existed beyond their small sphere of influence, that justice sometimes wore an unexpected face. At Thornmere, the seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, and Lydia discovered what it meant to live rather than merely survive. Winter came in earnest, blanketing the valley in snow that transformed the landscape into something from a fairy tale, all white silence and crystalline beauty. She learned to walk the grounds in boots lined with wool, her breath visible in the frozen air, her cheeks pink with cold and something deeper, contentment, perhaps, or the slow unfurling of joy. The household accepted her presence with gradual warmth. Mrs. Dawson, initially skeptical of this woman whose position seemed undefined by traditional roles, came to appreciate Lydia's quiet competence and genuine interest in the welfare of the staff. The younger maids confided in her their small troubles, and she listened without judgment, offering advice when asked and silence when that was more valuable. The gardener showed her which plants would bloom first in spring, teaching her their names in Latin and English, the ancient language of classification and the common tongue of daily use. Lord Grayson, though in private moments he asked her to call him simply Grayson, a permission that felt more intimate than any physical touch, continued his pattern of presence and absence. When a state business called him away, she felt his absence like a change in air pressure, a subtle shift that left the house feeling larger and emptier. When he returned, often late at night with mud on his boots and weariness in his eyes, she would hear his footsteps in the corridor and know that Thornmere was complete again, that the missing piece had returned to its proper place. Their friendship deepened in the quiet spaces between words. They developed a language of glances and gestures, small communications that carried more meaning than lengthy speeches. A book left open on a table was an invitation to discussion. A cup of tea prepared without asking meant someone had noticed the other seemed tired. A fire laid in the library before the other arrived spoke of thoughtfulness, of attention to small comforts, of care that needed no announcement. The household staff observed this growing intimacy with knowing eyes but respectful silence. They saw the way his grace softened when Mrs. Hartley entered a room, the way his stern features relaxed into something approaching peace. They noticed how she bloomed under his attention, how the timid woman who had arrived months ago was transforming into someone with opinions and laughter, someone who walked with her shoulders back and her head high. It was not a romance in the conventional sense. There were no stolen kisses, no whispered declarations in darkened corners. But it was love nonetheless, the kind that grows slowly and roots deeply, the kind that changes people from the inside out. Spring arrived with a violence of color that took Lydia's breath away. The valley exploded into bloom, flowers emerging from soil still cold with winter's memory, determined to live despite the harshness of their circumstances. She stood in the garden one morning, watching bees move drunkenly among the early roses, and felt a kinship with these fragile, persistent things that refused to be defeated by frost or darkness. Grayson found her there, his approach silent on the grass, still wet with dew. He stood beside her without speaking, watching the same bees, the same flowers, content simply to share the moment. Finally, he said, "I have a proposal to make." She turned to him, her heart suddenly quick in her chest, uncertain what he meant to propose. "There is a cottage on the eastern edge of the estate," he continued, his eyes on the horizon rather than her face. "It sits empty currently, in need of repair but structurally sound. I thought perhaps it could be transformed into a school." "A school," she repeated, surprised by the direction of his thoughts. "For whom?" "For the children of tenant farmers and estate workers. For the daughters especially, who have no education beyond what their mothers can provide." He looked at her then, and in his eyes was both hope and uncertainty. "I thought you might wish to teach them. Not the useless accomplishments society deems appropriate for young ladies, but real knowledge, reading, mathematics, history. The tools that would give them choices, possibilities beyond service or marriage to whoever will have them." Lydia felt tears gathering, but these were different from the tears of fear and sorrow she had shed at Ashford Heath. These were tears of recognition, of being understood so completely that her deepest desires were articulated before she knew she held them. "You would trust me with this?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "I would trust you with far more than this," he replied, and the weight of meaning in those words settled over them like a benediction. "You were cast aside because you could not bear children for a family that did not deserve them. But you could shape the minds of dozens of children, hundreds perhaps over time. You could give them what was nearly taken from you, the knowledge that their worth is not determined by others' expectations, that their lives can be larger than the boxes society tries to confine them in." She reached for his hand then, the first time she had initiated such contact, and laced her fingers through his. His hand was warm and solid, real in a way that made everything else, all the past hurts and humiliations, feel distant and powerless. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would like that very much." The cottage was transformed over the following months through the combined efforts of estate workers and Lydia's own vision. Walls were repaired and whitewashed, windows replaced, a small hearth built for warmth on cold mornings. Grayson commissioned the construction of simple desks and benches, purchased slates and chalk, books and maps. Word spread through the valley that the Duke's household was establishing a school, and that all children were welcome regardless of their parents' ability to pay. When the school opened on a bright morning in early summer, 15 children arrived, their faces scrubbed, and their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Lydia stood at the door to greet them, wearing a simple dress of blue cotton and the broken locket that had become her talisman, proof that damaged things could still hold value. She welcomed each child by name, having visited their families in the weeks prior, learning who they were and what they dreamed of becoming. Grayson attended the opening quietly, standing at the back of the room as Lydia began her first lesson. She spoke to the children about the power of reading, about how words could transport them beyond the valley, beyond their current circumstances, into worlds and ideas they could not yet imagine. He watched her face come alive with purpose, saw the children lean forward in their seats, hungry for what she offered, and felt something in his chest expand with an emotion he had thought himself too old and too weary to experience. Pride, yes, but also wonder at what happened when someone was given the freedom to become who they were meant to be. As the months passed, the school flourished. Children who had been destined for illiteracy learned to read. Girls who would have spent their lives in service discovered mathematics and science, history and literature. Parents who had been skeptical at first began to see changes in their children. Confidence, curiosity, the ability to question and think and imagine. Lydia taught not from a position of authority, but of shared discovery, learning alongside her students, admitting when she did not know an answer and showing them how to find it together. The success of the school brought visitors, educators from neighboring estates who wanted to see this experiment in universal education, ladies from surrounding villages who asked if they might send their own daughters. Lydia received them all with grace, shared her methods and materials freely, encouraged others to establish similar schools. She was becoming known not as the barren widow who had been rescued from disgrace, but as Mrs. Hartley, the educator, the woman who believed knowledge should be available to all regardless of birth or fortune. One evening, as summer deepened into autumn once more, Lydia and Grayson sat in the library as had become their custom. A year had passed since her arrival at Thornmere, a year that felt simultaneously like a lifetime in a single breath. She was reading a letter from a former student, a girl now working as a governess in a respectable household, her life transformed by the education Lydia had provided. Grayson watched her face as she read, saw the quiet satisfaction there, the sense of purpose fulfilled. "You've changed this valley," he said softly. "Changed those children's lives, their families' futures. You've done what I've been trying to do for years, given people the tools to lift themselves, to choose their own paths." He paused, setting down his own book. "You've changed me as well, though perhaps you don't realize it." She looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "How could I have changed you? You were already everything you needed to be, powerful, educated, free to live as you chose." "I was lonely," he said, the admission stark and honest. "I was performing the role of duke, managing estates and attending to duties, but I had forgotten what it meant to share a life with someone who saw me as something beyond my title. You reminded me that there are forms of wealth that have nothing to do with land or money, that the greatest privilege is not power over others, but the freedom to be known completely and accepted anyway." Lydia set the letter aside and moved to sit beside him on the sofa, closer than propriety would typically allow, but within the bounds of the intimacy they had built through months of conversation and companionship. "You gave me my life back," she said. "Or rather, you gave me a life I never had, the chance to be valued for what I could offer rather than what I failed to produce. Everything I am now, everything I've been able to do, exists because you saw worth in me when no one else did." "I only saw what was already there," he replied, his hand finding hers in the space between them. What Lady Constance and her ilk were too blind to recognize. His thumb traced circles on her palm, the touch gentle and reverent. "But I confess that what began as recognition has become something more. I find myself thinking of you when we're apart, anticipating your reactions to things I read or observe. You've become essential to my happiness in ways I did not expect and cannot now imagine living without." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like prayers ascending. Outside, the wind carried the scent of dying flowers and coming rain. Lydia felt the moment hovering between them, waited with possibility, and recognized it for what it was, a threshold, a choice, a chance to step forward into something neither of them could fully predict but both deeply wanted. "I love you," she said, the words simple and true. "Not because you saved me, though you did. Not because you gave me purpose, though you did that as well. But because of who you are when we sit together in this room. Thoughtful and kind, fierce in your protection of those weaker than yourself, willing to challenge convention when convention causes harm. You are the best man I have ever known, and loving you feels like the most honest thing I've ever done." He drew her closer, his arms encircling her with a tenderness that contradicted his reputation for sternness, his eyes searching hers for any trace of doubt or obligation. Finding only certainty reflected back at him, he smiled, that rare, transformative expression that turned his severe features beautiful. "I love you as well, Lydia Hartley. I love your courage and your compassion, your brilliant mind and your generous heart. I love the woman you were and the woman you're becoming, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." The proposal hung between them, not a demand or expectation, but an invitation offered with hope and humility. Lydia felt her heart expand with an emotion too large for her chest to contain, spilling out into the world as tears and laughter, trembling hands and breathless joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, gently at first, and then with growing passion. A kiss that tasted of firelight and rain, of books and gardens, of all the moments that had led them to this one. When they finally drew apart, both breathless and smiling, the world seemed to have rearranged itself into a new configuration, one where their happiness was not only possible but actual, solid, real. The announcement of their engagement sent ripples through the local society. Some were scandalized, a duke marrying a widow of uncertain status, a woman with no fortune and no family of consequence. But others saw it as romantic, proof that true affection could transcend the rigid hierarchies that governed their world. The servants at Thornmere celebrated with genuine joy, having witnessed the growing connection between their master and the woman who had transformed the household with her quiet presence. Lady Constance received the news with tight-lipped fury, recognizing it as the final defeat in a battle she had lost the moment Lord Grayson intervened. Her daughters, particularly Arabella, who had harbored hopes of becoming a duchess herself, felt the sting of having been passed over for someone they had dismissed as beneath notice. But their opinions mattered little in the face of Lydia's newfound happiness, their judgment rendered powerless by the simple fact that she no longer resided within their sphere of influence. The wedding took place in the small chapel on Thornmere grounds on a crisp autumn morning when the valley blazed with color. It was a modest ceremony by aristocratic standards, no grand assemblies or elaborate festivities, just the household staff and tenant families, the children from the school carrying flowers, the local vicar speaking words of blessing over two people who had found each other against all odds. Lydia wore a dress of ivory silk, simple in design but beautiful in its elegant lines, and around her neck hung a new locket, this one whole and gleaming, a gift from Grayson containing a miniature portrait of them together. But she kept the old broken locket as well, tucked away in a drawer where she could see it daily, a reminder of where she had been and how far she had traveled. As they stood before the altar, hands joined and hearts full, the vicar spoke of love as an act of recognition, of seeing the divine spark in another person and choosing to honor it, protect it, nurture it into flame. Lydia looked at Grayson and saw reflected in his eyes the same wonder she felt, that two people so different in circumstance could find in each other such perfect understanding, such complete acceptance. When they emerged from the chapel as husband and wife, the children from the school scattered flower petals before them, and the autumn sun broke through clouds to bathe the valley in golden light. It was a moment of such pure joy that even the cynics in attendance felt their hearts soften, felt the possibility that perhaps love could indeed triumph over the rigid structures of class and expectation. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were those who never fully accepted Lydia as the Duchess of Thornmere, who whispered about her low origins and her barrenness as if these were sins rather than circumstances. But Grayson stood beside her always, his support unwavering, his respect for her growing with each passing season. Together they expanded the school, eventually establishing 3 more throughout the valley, each one providing education to children who would otherwise have been denied it. Lydia became a mother not through biology, but through the dozens of students who passed through her classroom, children who learned from her example that worth was not determined by birth or fortune, but by character and kindness, by the choices one made and the lives one touched. Some of those students went on to become teachers themselves, spreading the philosophy of universal education to regions beyond Thornmere. Others became shopkeepers and clerks, governesses and midwives, their lives expanded by the knowledge that they had choices, that they could shape their own destinies. And though Lydia never bore children of her own, she and Grayson created something equally valuable, a legacy of compassion and justice, a small corner of the world transformed by the belief that every person deserved dignity, opportunity, and the freedom to become who they were meant to be. The valley flourished under their stewardship, not because they ruled with an iron hand, but because they led with open hearts, because they recognized that true power lay not in domination, but in lifting others up. On quiet evenings, they still met in the library, now with silver threading through Lydia's dark hair and lines of laughter etched around Grayson's eyes. They would read together in companionable silence, or sometimes simply sit and watch the fire, hands intertwined, grateful for the unlikely path that had brought them together. The broken locket, now kept in a place of honor on Lydia's writing desk, served as a talisman, a reminder that brokenness was not the end of the story, that cracks could let in light, that what the world deemed worthless could prove to be priceless beyond measure. Sometimes students would ask Lydia about her past, about how she had come to Thornmere and built the life she now lived. She would tell them honestly about being dismissed as barren, about the fear of being sent away to an institution designed to break what little spirit she had remaining. She would describe the moment when Grayson intervened, not as a fairy tale rescue, but as one human being recognizing the worth of another and choosing to act on that recognition. "The world will try to tell you who you are," she would say to the girls especially, those who faced the same rigid expectations she had once confronted. "It will measure you against impossible standards and find you wanting. But you are not defined by what you cannot do or do not have. You are defined by your kindness, your courage, your willingness to keep becoming even when the world wants you to stop. Never let anyone convince you that your value lies in your ability to serve their purposes. You are valuable simply because you exist, simply because you are you. And the children would listen with wide eyes, understanding perhaps only partially, but carrying her words like seeds that would germinate later, in moments of their own struggle and doubt. Some would remember her teachings decades later, would pass them on to their own children, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond the small valley where it all began. As Lydia grew older, she sometimes thought about Lady Constance and wondered what had become of her. News, filtered occasionally from Ashford Heath. Arabella had married a man of suitable rank but little warmth, her life respectable but joyless. Cecilia had died young of a fever that no physician could cure. Lady Constance herself had aged into bitterness, the kind that comes from spending a lifetime enforcing rules that brought no happiness, only the hollow satisfaction of being correct in one's judgments. Lydia felt no triumph in learning this, only a distant sadness for lives spent in pursuit of approval and status, for hearts that had never learned to value anything beyond social position. She had been given the gift of a second chance, the opportunity to discover that there were forms of richness that had nothing to do with lineage or wealth. Not everyone receives such gifts, and she never took hers for granted. The seasons continued their eternal rotation, spring blooming into summer, autumn blazing into winter, year after year marking time with flowers and frost, births and deaths, all the small joys and sorrows that constitute a life fully lived. Through it all, Lydia and Grayson remained partners in the truest sense, each supporting the other's growth, each celebrating the other's victories, each offering comfort in moments of loss or difficulty. When Grayson died, after a long illness borne with characteristic dignity, Lydia felt the loss like a physical wound, a tearing away of something essential. She mourned deeply and honestly, allowing herself the full weight of grief without shame or apology. But even in her sorrow, she recognized the extraordinary gift they had given each other, not just love, though there had been abundant love, but the freedom to be fully themselves, to grow and change and become without constraint or judgment. She continued teaching until her own health began to fail, finally retiring to spend quiet days in the library they had shared, reading the books they had discussed, remembering conversations that had shaped her understanding of the world. On her final day, surrounded by former students who had become teachers themselves, by children of those students who represented the future she had helped to create, she held the broken locket one last time and smiled. "It was all worth it," she whispered to those gathered near. Every moment of fear and doubt, every humiliation and heartbreak, it was worth it to arrive at this. To have lived with purpose, to have loved and been loved, to have made some small corner of the world better than I found it. That's all any of us can hope for, and I received far more than I ever dared to hope. She closed her eyes then, the broken locket warm in her palm, and slipped away as gently as snow falling on the valley she had made her home. Those who mourned her did not mourn a barren widow or a woman of low status. They mourned an educator, a reformer, a woman who had proven through her life that worth was not inherited or assigned but created through the simple act of refusing to accept the world's diminishing judgments, of insisting on one's own value even when everyone else denied it. The school she founded continued for generations, evolving with the times but always maintaining its core mission to provide education to those who would otherwise be denied it, to teach that every person possessed inherent dignity and deserved the opportunity to flourish. Her grave in the Thornmere Chapel bore a simple inscription: Lydia Hartley, Duchess of Thornmere, educator, beloved wife. She taught us to see, and in that seeing, in the recognition of worth beyond conventional measures, in the acknowledgement that broken things could still be beautiful, that discarded lives could yet bloom into something magnificent, lay her truest legacy. Not children of her body, but children of her spirit, carrying forward into the world the revolutionary idea that everyone deserved dignity, that everyone had value, that love and purpose were available to all who had the courage to claim them. The valley continued its ancient rhythms after she was gone, seasons turning, flowers blooming and fading, children growing into adults who would teach their own children the lessons they had learned. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the light turned golden and the wind carried the scent of dying roses, those who walked the grounds of Thormere swore they could feel her presence still, not as a ghost but as a blessing, a gentle reminder that the broken places in our lives are often where the light gets in, where transformation begins, where we finally learn what it means to be fully, gloriously, imperfectly human. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts in us is what most makes us human.